Now, there's a lot of discussion over the years in the history of the church about why we have four gospels and how they all work together to give us this sort of like far richer picture of Jesus than we would ever have had if we'd had just one biography of him. And of course, the first of the four gospels, at least the way that it's laid out in the canon that we have it at the moment, is Matthew's gospel. And Matthew's often seen as a bridge between the Old Testament history of the church, which was very much focused on the nation of Israel, and the New Testament history of the church as it begins to be established throughout the nations of the world. And the reason is that the reason why Matthew is sort of seen as that bridge is because of the four gospels, Matthew seems to be most self-consciously presenting Jesus as the fulfillment and the climax of everything that has been going on in the Old Testament. I mean, Matthew really underlines the continuity between everything Jesus had been doing before his incarnation and everything that he's doing after it. There's like at least 29 sort of direct quotations from the Old Testament. And a lot of them are, okay, this is fulfilling this prophecy by this prophet. And there are at least, I think there's a few more than this actually, but this is a kind of conservative scholarly estimate here. There's at least 120 other kind of allusions or deliberate echoes or implicit fulfillments throughout Matthew's gospel. So, there's only 28 chapters in Matthew. So there's an awful lot of Matthew is given over to kind of drawing this sense of continuity between Old and New Testament. And it's ideas like, Jesus is greater than Noah. He's greater than Moses. He's greater than Solomon. He's greater than Jonah. These giants of the Old Testament. And they're all explicitly referenced. And it's like Matthew's going, and Jesus is the fulfillment of all of them. In fact, for Matthew, Jesus is like the fulfillment of everything. He's the fulfillment of the tabernacle. He's the fulfillment of the sacrifices, the priests, the prophets, the kings, the judges. He's the fulfillment of wisdom. He's the fulfillment of everything. And the other thing you get that in this that Matthew's kind of really consciously drawing, if you like, on the Old Testament, you get this sense in which Jesus revisits kind of key moments in the Old Testament. But whereas the church got things wrong, Jesus gets them right. So he relives Eden and faces the temptation of Satan, but he resists the devil and triumphs over the ancient serpent. He sort of relives Exodus, coming out of Egypt. But he actually brings freedom from the tyranny of Satan and sin and death and brings his people into the new creation. He relives the exile, but he actually brings us back into the presence of God and restores and rebuilds the people of God and their worship. These massive realities that are foreshadowed in the Old Testament are now realized in Jesus. So that's a huge deal to bear in mind as we work our way through Matthew's gospel. But there's another idea in the history of the church about the gospels and about the gospel of Matthew. And it's been around for a long, long time. And it kind of intrigues me. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure what to do with this. I don't know if you know the book of Ezekiel. But in Ezekiel chapter 1, you have this extraordinary vision of Christ on his throne, and he's being carried. The throne is being carried by these four living creatures. And in Ezekiel 1, Ezekiel looks at these four living creatures and he tries to describe them. And one of the things he says about them is each of them had four faces. Their faces looked like this. Each of the four had the face of a human being, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. And there's this really ancient idea in the church that each of the gospels is like one of these four living creatures bearing Christ into the world. And that each of the four gospels sort of resonates in particular ways with one of the four faces on these living creatures and what they're representing. So the idea is that John is the eagle, Luke is the ox, Mark is the lion, and Matthew is the human being. And, in the history of the church, that's been a big deal. So like way back in the 2nd century, there was a guy who was the Bishop of Lyon in what we would now call France, a guy called Irenaeus. And he writes a whole big section about this. And he gets to Matthew as the gospel of the human being. And he said, this book is the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. It is the gospel of his humanity. And Irenaeus is kind of driving at this idea that Matthew's gospel particularly is underlining for us not just what it means for Jesus to be fully human, but actually what it means for us to be fully human as well. That Jesus is making us fully human. He has become fully human in order to make us fully human. And that gives you a real insight into Matthew's gospel. And it is interesting that during periods where the church has really taken the question of discipleship seriously, it's Matthew's gospel that has come to the fore. It's almost like Matthew's gospel was designed for this, and the Spirit has used it for this in the history of the church. And I think it's quite a helpful way of thinking about discipleship, actually, the process of becoming more fully human. That we're learning what it is to be a human being in relationship with God, living alongside others who are in relationship with God, learning together how to live the way God designed us to live in a world that is so often just diametrically opposed to God's vision for life. So you've got this bit in Matthew 22, for example, right, where these clowns come to Jesus in the temple and they're like, is it right to pay the poll tax to Caesar or not? And you remember what Jesus does? He gets them to bring him a coin, and he asks them, whose image is on this coin? And they, okay, well, Caesar's. And Jesus says, right, well, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's. So, this coin bears the image of Caesar. It belongs to Caesar. Give it to Caesar. And then he goes on and he says, and give to God what is God's. And so you're like, whoa, hang on a minute. What is it that is God's? Well, it's what bears his image. And Jesus is like, you've got to give, if you want to be fully human, you've got to kind of give yourself as an image bearer of God. You've got to give yourself to God. That's kind of takes you into the heart of what Matthew's really driving at. And if you think about the way Matthew's gospel ends, this idea of disciple making and discipleship just is absolutely front and center stage. So Matthew just really draws out Jesus saying about the disciples, you go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And for years, people have gone, that's the verse that really unlocks Matthew, isn't it? That Jesus has been teaching this group of people how to be disciples, and now they are to go into the whole world and teach other people everything he has taught them about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And this agenda is one that makes Matthew actually quite a dangerous gospel to read. It's really open to kind of misinterpretation. You see, the question that Matthew's gospel is really answering is this whole question of what do I have to do as a disciple of Jesus? How do I live as a disciple of Jesus? And that means it is open to being misinterpreted in a really kind of unhelpful, legalistic kind of way. And you sort of, even now, you still hear that when you hear people say things like, oh, yes, I'm a Christian. I try to live by the Sermon on the Mount. And you're like, mate, you have no idea what being a Christian is about. You see, this legalism thing, that I have to live a certain way in order to be acceptable to God. It's quite a complex problem, actually, legalism. But that's basically it. It's this fundamental misunderstanding. You see, being a Christian is about us being reconciled to God through Christ. It's about us being grafted into the life of God in Christ, so that the Spirit of God is living the life of God in us and through us. And because of that, the Spirit is constantly changing us and transforming us into something that looks more faithfully and more authentically like the image of God in which we were created. And so we find that because of our relationship with God in Jesus, and because of the Spirit dwelling within us, that we begin to think differently and feel differently and behave differently and live differently. And it's the key thing is that our life of Christ likeness flows out of our relationship and our experience of God in Christ. And again, you see this in Matthew's gospel so clearly. This idea that our transformation, our process of discipleship is born out of our relationship and our experience of God. So you think about the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. where Jesus is teaching us about how dangerous anger is and how we've got to be completely free of anger in our relationships and our dealings with one another. And in that context, he talks about, he says, look, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, well, leave your gift there at the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. Now, you think about that moment, and you know, the point is that the altar, with everything that teaches us and prophesies to us about Jesus and his death and the sacrifice of his death and what that achieves, the altar is the place where God's anger is turned away from us and where he is reconciled to us. And you know, the thing is, when we are caught up in that experience of knowing God's anger turned away, of being reconciled to God, well, of course, that's going to shape how we relate to other people. So out of that comes our experience now of not dealing in anger with other people. But legalism puts everything backwards and says, look, if you want to be in relationship with God, if you want to be loved by God, then you need to do all the things God says. And if you do them well enough, then maybe God will accept you and God will enter into relationship with you. All right. And because of the nature of the emphases of Matthew's gospel, it is quite open to this sort of misinterpretation. And the reason is not because of a problem with Matthew, but a problem with us. Fallen humanity, we are hardwired for legalism. Instinctively, it's how we think. It's how we structure life at personal and at a societal level. You know, it's how we operate in pretty much every sphere of life, this kind of performance-based way of dealing with people. And naturally, that's how we think about religion as well, as a performance-based thing. So when we're presented with a vision for Christian living, for discipleship, our natural instinct as sinful human beings is to treat that as a to-do list, right? This is what I have to do if I'm going to be good enough for God. Now, Matthew and the Spirit inspiring Matthew is really sensitive to this. And so he actually works really hard to guard against legalism. And there are three main ways that he does that, which we're going to look at before we take just a few minutes break. All right. So the first way, and I think of this as kind of a negative way of guarding us against interpreting the gospel legalistically. Negatively, Matthew really draws out of Jesus's teaching and records for us and emphasizes for us the way in which Jesus hammers sort of self-righteous, legalistic approaches to a relationship with his Father. Right? And the way this articulates itself in the gospel, obviously, is the way in which Jesus goes after the Pharisees, who kind of are presented as the guys who really epitomize this legalistic approach to religion. And it's right from the word go, okay? Jesus' first sermon, Matthew 5:20, your righteousness, says Jesus, you're right. It has to surpass that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law. It's got to be this totally different quality of righteousness and holiness. Otherwise, and this is quite important, otherwise you won't even get into the kingdom of heaven. All right, so you see, Jesus is saying, look, it's not that the Pharisees, they've just got things a bit mixed up. It's just an unhelpful way of thinking about being a disciple. It's Jesus like, these guys aren't even in the kingdom of heaven at all. That's how dangerous legalism is. And the whole Pharisaic way of doing religion, again, Matthew really draws this out of Jesus's teaching. It actually alienates us from God. And one of the things we want to do as we're going through Matthew's gospel is to really pay attention to the way that Pharisees try to do religion, and really study that so that you can recognize it in yourself and avoid it like the plague. All right. Now, this is a theme that goes right through the gospel. One of Jesus's last sermons in Matthew 23 is this huge section where he just goes for the Pharisees one last time and shows them just how dangerous their legalism is. He just says stuff about it. He says, you don't enter the kingdom of heaven, and you're stopping others from entering it. He actually calls them the children of hell. He says they're hypocrites and whitewashed tombs and full of greed and self-indulgence. They're a brood of vipers who will be condemned to hell. And actually, the most tragic thing is they are not willing to come to God. All right, so the first defense that Matthew puts in his gospel against it being misinterpreted legalistically is he just shows us Jesus exposing the dynamics of legalism and underlining how deadly it is. All right, and it's really captured when you hear Jesus say, he's warning his disciples, and he says, don't follow these guys. They are blind guides. All right, so that's the first way Matthew guards against legalism. The second way he guards against legalism is he really emphasizes Jesus's teaching about the nature of true righteousness and holiness. All right, and for Jesus, our righteousness is not just about papering over the cracks, okay? Jesus isn't going for some kind of superficial surface level change. You know, that's what the Pharisees were doing. They only cared about how they looked to other people, not what was actually going on inside. One of the big criticisms of the Pharisees is that they practiced their righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. But Jesus is like, man, that is so inadequate. All right, we need to change not just what you do. We need to change what you are. All right, and if you read through Matthew's gospel and just pick out the ways that Jesus describes us before he redeems us, man, it is really brutal. Jesus actually he says you're evil. He says you're spiritually dead. He teaches that before we're his disciples, we're defiled and unclean. And his thing is, look, the problem isn't what's outside of us. You know, as if, well, you know, if you just fixed your environment, or if you have good experiences of how other people treat you, or if you have a good education or something, you know, that's what makes you a good person. And no. That's not what makes you behave the way you behave. All right. Jesus' point is that you act and think out of what's inside of you. All right. The phrase Jesus uses is we act and speak and think out of the overflow of our hearts. So for Jesus, the reason that we do evil things is because we have an evil nature. All right. So Matthew 15, verses 18 and 19, the things that come out of a person's heart is what defiles them. You know, out of the heart come evil thoughts. And I think we struggle with that because for us, that's a really countercultural way to think about humanity. You know, we tend to think that basically people are good, but sometimes they do bad things. Jesus is like, no, buddy, people are bad. That's why they do bad things. All right. So Jesus's strategy for disciple making is actually not just to change our behavior. Jesus's strategy is to change what we are, change our nature. So again, Matthew 12, his thing is like, make the tree good and its fruit will be good. So Jesus is like, look, let's not even think about behavior in a way for a minute. Let's just sort you out. Let's change your nature, change what you are. And then, you know, the behavior, if you like, will flow quite naturally, as it were, out of that. So Jesus's project of renewal and transformation is like far more extensive than we tend to realize. Like, he wants to fundamentally change what we are as people, change our heart so that what comes out of us will be good and life-giving. All right, so Matthew's guarding against this legalistic interpretation of the gospel. Negatively, he shows how Jesus hammers legalism in the Pharisees. Positively, he shows how Jesus wants to change us and how fundamental and deep that is and how dependent we are for that on our relationship with God. But the third way that Matthew guards against legalism, and I think this is probably his main thing, right? This is his first line of defense, is that he weaves Jesus's teaching about how we are called to live as disciples. He weaves that teaching in and out of showing us who Jesus is and what Jesus does for us. All right, so when you read Matthew's gospel, you can never separate out Jesus's teaching about what we're supposed to be from who Jesus himself is, as if you could have some sort of abstract moral philosophy that could be applied to human life without any reference to Jesus. For Matthew, you can't do that. All right, you can only respond to Jesus' teaching in the context of who Jesus is and what Jesus does. All right, and our righteousness, our holiness will always be dependent and it will always be a response to who Jesus is and what Jesus has done in the gospel, in his earthly ministry, but also what he's doing in us now by his Spirit. All right, and so Matthew is at pains to give us this powerful, all-encompassing sort of vision of Jesus. It's like it's cosmic stuff, you know. And he's always challenging us. Matthew's always challenging us. He said, "Look, your vision of Jesus isn't deep enough. It's not rich enough. It's not immense enough." And he's constantly showing us there's always more to Jesus and more to what he's done than you realize yet. And he's inviting us into the gospel deeper and deeper to discover that. You see, so Jesus, for example, is the only point of access to the life of God. You get this in Matthew 11:27, where Jesus says, look, no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. And it's this Jesus who has come into his creation now to be a part of his creation in human form. All right. And for Matthew, I think this is the key thing that changes as we move from Old Testament into New Testament. It's the incarnation. All right. Jesus, who has been present in and who's been working throughout the Old Testament as the covenant God of Israel, now takes on the likeness of sinful flesh. So right at the start of the gospel, you have this sense of Jesus has become a human being. Now, why? Why has he done that? Well, his death is in view right from the word go. All right, the angel says to Joseph in Matthew 1 that what is conceived in Mary is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. And the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1, we normally skip over that bit, right? But it sets this up brilliantly. Right, there's so much going on in the way Matthew introduces Jesus's family tree. You know, he's the Messiah, he's the Davidic king, the promised child of Abraham. He's bringing about the end of the exile. You know, these are all ideas that you're picking up as you read through that list of names in the first chapter of Matthew. And it's like you see Jesus catching up the whole history of the people of God in himself. And then the way Matthew introduces Jesus within the genealogy is amazing. Chapter 1:16, Jacob is the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah, which of course breaks the pattern of every other line in this genealogy and in every genealogy that there has been in the whole Bible. Because in genealogies, it always goes, so-and-so is the father of so-and-so, who is the father of so-and-so. Right? And then suddenly it's like, and Mary is the mother of Jesus. And he's making the point that this child has been born of a woman. And he's taking us right back to the promise in Genesis 3 that our redemption would come through the seed of the woman, and not from the seed of a man. All right. And so now here's this promise that's being fulfilled all these generations later. Finally, here is the seed, the child born of a woman who will crush the serpent's head. And it's made explicit in Matthew 1:23. The virgin will conceive and will give birth to a son. Right? This is the child that we've been waiting for almost the entire history of creation. The child promised in Isaiah 9:6, to us a child is born. And I don't know if you've ever noticed as you read through Matthew 1 and 2, how often Jesus is actually simply referred to as the child. It's worth just having a quick look at that. All right, so Jesus becomes like us so that we can become like him. He becomes fully human so that we can become fully human. That's the goal of our redemption. That's what Jesus is about in Matthew's gospel. All right, now, we're used to the idea, I suppose, that through the virgin birth, Jesus takes on humanity. But there's a sense in which, yeah, Jesus is like us, but there's a deep sense in which Jesus isn't like us through the virgin birth, all right? Because he's taking on humanity, but he's not taking on sinful humanity, all right? And there's this deep tension that there is, that he's got Adam's nature, as it were, but he doesn't have Adam's sin, Adam's guilt. And so there's a further step of identification that is needed with us, where he identifies and aligns himself up with our sinfulness as well as with our humanity. And that happens in the baptism of John in chapter 3, where Jesus becomes united with us in our sinfulness. All right. And there's that moment where Jesus is orienting himself now towards the cross. He has identified with, counted amongst the transgressors. And, for us, we might think, oh my gosh, that's such a tragedy. But from heaven's perspective, this is the whole point. All right. And heaven delights in the willingness of the Son to kind of identify with fallen, sinful humanity with a view to redeeming it. And you almost get this sense of the pride of the Father's heart. At that moment, Matthew tells us, heaven is open, and he hears the Father say, this is my Son whom I love, and with him I am well pleased. And the Spirit comes down on Jesus like a dove, and alights on him. And it's like as if the Spirit's thinking, right, if he's going to go to the cross to redeem all of creation from the curse, then I will anoint him for that. And that actually is what Jesus is here to do, right? To redeem all of creation from the curse. You get it in Matthew chapter 19, verse 28, where Jesus talks about how he has come to accomplish, listen to this, the renewal of all things, right? And it's like this brilliant thing where Jesus is taking on everything that is wrong with the world in order to deal with it. Right? He's becoming part of this creation in order to cleanse it and renew it and rescue it from the curse. All right? And you see this all the way through his ministry, but obviously it comes to its apex as he approaches the cross. He's going to die. Right? This is the utter depths of the curse. He's going to die. He's going to enter death, and he's going to bear God's rejection in his death. He's going to bear forsakenness, God's rejection of everything that is wrong with the world, which Jesus kind of becomes as he's on the cross. God's anger against all that is sinful, God's rejection of that, God's judgment of it. He's going to take it all. And it's like he's going to take all of creation and take it through death with him. He's going to take creation through judgment with him. The early church fathers had this image of like a needle and a thread. And as the needle pierces the fabric of death, so as the needle draws through it, so it draws through the thread that's attached to it. And there's a sense that Jesus has become part of creation. And as this part of creation goes through death and judgment, and is resurrected into this new creation life, so that's going to draw all of creation after him through that. And all of creation will be judged and cleansed and resurrected into this renewed existence in which death no longer is a feature. The exile is over. There's no more curse. There's no more sin. There is no more death. And it's like, if we're caught up with that, with what Jesus is doing, then we are becoming part of that new creation, and we begin to live in a way that is about anticipating its life here and now. Right? And this is immense. Okay. And there's a sense in which, it's like we could never work out what that means. That's just too colossal for us to wrap our heads around. What does it mean to live a life where the power of sin is broken, to live a life that is no longer overshadowed by the reality of death? What does it mean to live this new creation life? We have no idea. And Jesus is like, it's okay. It's all right. I will teach you. All right. I will model this for you, but I'll also break it down and show you how to live the redeemed, renewed life of God, even while you are still here in this old cursed creation that's passing away. Right? And that teaching is what we will come back and look at in just a couple of minutes. So I'm just going to pause the recording. Right, we're off and running. So what does it actually mean then to live this new creation life, to grow into our full humanity in relationship with God and in relationship with each other? Now, Jesus lays out the core elements of discipleship, his vision for renewed humanity. He lays it out in 5 blocks of teaching. Which is quite a thing in itself, but we'll get into that right now. But it's always worth playing a little game with yourself in moments like this. All right, so Jesus is going to lay out the essence of discipleship in 5 blocks, the absolute core, critical elements of discipleship in 5 blocks. Now, if I was going to do that, what would I say? What do I think are the core foundational elements of Christian discipleship? And it's worth just kind of thinking, okay, what would I think? And then listen to what Jesus has to say and see how well those 2 lists of things kind of corresponds. Now, remember, as we do this, remember, Matthew wants us to understand that Jesus' teaching comes to us in the context of Jesus himself, right? Who Jesus is, what Jesus has done for us. We are invited in the Gospel of Matthew to become part of that. And it's only when we're part of that, part of Jesus and what he's doing, that we can actually begin to live this new life, or at least begin to learn how to do this, how to live according to the policies and the ethos and the culture of his kingdom, which is a different creation, a different reality. And so as we're reading through Matthew's gospel, we need to be keeping that in mind all the time. You see that actually one of the coolest things about Jesus is he's actually able to sort stuff out. He's able to do something about the problems of the world. He actually drives back the chaos and the darkness of the world. He defeats Satan. He calms the storms. He deals with the demonic. He cleanses the unclean. He heals the sick and the suffering and the paralyzed. He deals with disability, and he reaches into death and kind of pulls people out of it. And it's like, and there's these beautiful moments where it's like you're shown how his heart. He doesn't just do these things. He longs to do these things. He wants to do them. He goes out of his way to do them, even just for like 1 or 2 people. All right. So if you can imagine walking with Jesus, you would have had, actually, just by being with him, you would have had a foretaste of the new creation, of what life would be like with the curse and sin and all its consequences, kind of all that's undone and lifted, and the world is renewed and his kingdom is established. It's like watching a trailer for a film, right? And then the question becomes, do you want to be with me and to be a part of this? That's, Jesus shows you, gives you a taste of new creation life. This is what life would be like without the sin and the curse. A life without death, without sickness, a life with, do you want to be a part of this for real? Do you want to step away from the old dying creation that is kind of laboring under this curse? And do you want to become part of this new creation that you're beginning to get a whisper of in my ministry, where life looks so different? And that is the dominating theme of Jesus's ministry, right from the word go. Chapter 4, verse 17. From that time on, Jesus began to preach, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. It's like, step out of that old creation, that kingdom of death and curse and sin. And my kingdom is right here. Do you want it? Repent, turn away. But the kingdom of heaven has come near. And we think, oh, I could never be part of that. You know what I mean? There's no way I've got what it takes to be included in that. There's no way I could turn my life around to that extent. And you're like, oh man, that is exactly the legalism that Matthew is working so hard to avoid, right? That's what he's laying out Jesus' first sermon for us, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7. He's so careful to pick an example of Jesus' teaching that starts by torpedoing that whole way of thinking. The first thing Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. All right. So who's invited to be a part of the kingdom? Who qualifies? Right? Who's this for? It's for those who have no spiritual resources or capital with which to do business with God. All right, that's it. If you don't have what it takes to be in the kingdom of heaven, then you're welcome. That's it. Come and be a part of it. Come and be blessed, part of what God is doing in the history of the world. All right, blessed are those who mourn. All right, and all these words are words that are coming with huge theological freight. They're all words that are used deeply in the Old Testament. So this idea of mourning, Joel 1, you have those who mourn because the people of God have turned away from him. Or Ezekiel 9, people mourn because of the sin committed in Jerusalem. So, you know, I hate who I am. I hate this world. I hate the way it's cursed and sinful and the way death overshadows everything and it's all meaningless. That breaks my heart. Jesus is like, brilliant, you're in. Come on, that's exactly what we need. Blessed are the meek. I mean, just read through Psalm 37 and see what's going on with meekness. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. It's not just that I'm brokenhearted over the state of the world and over what I am. It's like I long to be like Jesus, and I long to be in a world of righteousness, this new creation. Jesus is like, brilliant, come on, that's exactly what I'm looking for. All right, the blessed are the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, those who are all about being at peace with God and at peace with one another. All right, those are the foundations on which the life of discipleship can be built. All right, that's what it's all about. All right, but straight away, Jesus says, okay, but if you're like this, there will be an acute tension with the rest of creation as it is. All right, and Jesus immediately raises the question of suffering and persecution. He's quite clear. That you cannot live the new creation life openly, which is what being a disciple is about. Okay, so we're called to be the city on the hill, the lamp on the lampstand. These things cannot be hidden. But if you're going to be like living your life as a Christian in a way that's not hidden, then you will antagonize the kind of the rest of fallen, cursed creation that is still in slavery and bondage to Satan and sin. Okay, now, one of the most surprising things in the Sermon on the Mount, perhaps, is that Jesus actually, in a deep sense, doesn't say anything new. All right? As he lays out this vision for the new creation, it's the same as it's always been. It's how Jesus called the church to live way back when Moses was going to bring the church into the new creation of Canaan. All right? And Jesus actually takes us back to that. He takes us back to the law. All right, and in Matthew 5 he says, like, I'm not getting rid of the law. All right, quite the opposite. Right, I want to take the law and embed it into the very depths of your being so that it shapes everything about you, everything that comes out of you. Right, which is the way it's always supposed to have been. Right, back in Deuteronomy 5, all right, we read the 10 commandments. They're all laid out for us there. And in Deuteronomy 6 verse 6, the Lord says, these commandments that I give you today are to be on your heart. All right. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is just kind of showing us what that would be like, what it's like to have the law of God written on your heart, the expression of God's character, right, embedded right at the foundational levels of our being, the deepest level of who we are, so that it shapes everything about us, how we think, how we feel, how we act, how we behave in relationships with other people. And Jesus models that. He fulfills that for us. And then he's like teaching us how to live that life after him. And underpinning that new character, that new way of living, is this profound, vivid experience of our relationship with God. Now, we've already thought about that a little bit. But in Matthew 6, the point is that the way we experience our relationship with God is through things like what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount, prayer and fasting and giving and being taught the scriptures and learning together how to put those things into practice, learning to trust the sovereignty and the providence of our Heavenly Father. And so, often as Christians, we find ourselves thinking that I really struggle to live the way Christ commands us to live. And the question then is, are we putting in place the devotional practices that give us access, if you like, to the experience of our relationship with God? Because that is what gives us the resources then to live the life that we are being called to live. You need Matthew 6 in place before you can live Matthew 5, if I can put it like that. And it is worth noting that for Jesus, the key thing is actually that we live as Christ commands. Right? That is the defining issue. All right, the Sermon on the Mount finishes with that parable of the wise and the foolish builders. And the thing that separates wise and foolish builders is one person hears the words of Christ and puts them into practice, and the other one doesn't. Now, it's easy. I think it's easy for us to just kind of go, oh, I could never put that into practice. I could never live the Sermon on the Mount. No one could live like that in this world. Except, of course, you look at Jesus, and he does live like that. And then if you flick over into the book of Acts, actually you see the disciples do live like that. And they live like that because Jesus has taught them, trained them how to live in a particular way. And it's amazing, in the epistles, there's this clear expectation that this is how Christians live. And again, as you read the epistles, you see the apostles reaching back to the Sermon on the Mount and using that and saying, this is how we are to live as people who are learning what it is to be fully human, anticipating life in the new creation. All right, so Jesus teaches us in the Sermon on the Mount, that's the first discourse, about our, if you like, our own life as a disciple. But then in the second discourse, he goes on to teach about our being involved in making other disciples. Now, it's important that we take this on board, because I think in Western Christianity, we've been taught to think about Christianity, to think about our being Christians in ways that aren't necessarily involved with making other disciples. But I think that is actually to disregard the teaching of Jesus. All right, his whole second discourse is about disciples making disciples. All right, and now again, we tend to think backwards on this stuff. All right, so if you have Matthew 10 open in front of you, all right, now the way we think about evangelism and disciple making is that, well, we sort of know that if we are bold about our faith, all right, if we're not hidden, and like Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, if we're proactive in living as a Christian and in talking to other people about following Jesus, we know, right? We know that will cause problems. It'll cause problems in our families. It'll cause problems in work. It'll cause problems in our communities. There will be legal and relational repercussions. And therefore, we tend to reason, well, because this is going to cause problems, we probably shouldn't do it. All right? We could have had this keep the peace mentality. Now, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 34, Jesus actually says, don't suppose I've come to bring peace on earth. All right? Jesus is like fully aware that as we live openly as disciple-making disciples, right, there will be suffering, persecution, and loss as a result of that. All right? Jesus is like, you will be hated by everyone because of me. I think this is something actually we're going to have to rediscover in the West, where the church is increasingly seen as this oppressive thing, where Christian beliefs are seen as damaging to people and repressive, and where Christianity is seen as an intolerant thing and something that is an obstacle to a more progressive society. Matthew 10 may well be a passage that we are increasingly gravitating towards in years to come. You see, Jesus teaches, it's kind of disturbing in a way. Jesus teaches in Matthew 10 that as we seek to be disciple-making disciples, right, what's going to happen? Well, we'll be arrested and interrogated and tortured and betrayed by and ostracized from our families. And that we should do it anyway and endure those consequences. You know, Jesus kind of sets himself up and says, look, I am worth suffering for. And so the Lamb of God sends his disciples out to be sheep among wolves, which, however way you look at it, is not a particularly encouraging image. But it's interesting that Matthew 10 is a passage that is treasured by the persecuted church. And they look at that and they go, brilliant, because this is where Jesus teaches us how to resist the temptation to hide our faith, to not talk to people. This is where Jesus teaches us how to overcome fear. This is where Jesus teaches us how to overcome anxiety and how to endure loss in the cause of Christ. This is where we come to understand that God works through suffering. That suffering just isn't an unfortunate incidental sort of consequence that you could probably do without. That actually suffering is integral to the strategy of God. That he works through the suffering and the death of Jesus to bring the gospel into being. And then he works through the suffering and the death of the church to redeem people through that gospel. And you see, this Matthew 10 is where Jesus trains us how to suffer in the cause of the kingdom. This is where he teaches us that keeping our comfort, keeping our homes, keeping our jobs, keeping our families, keeping our liberty, even keeping our lives, that is not our priority. Our priority is to be faithful to Christ. You know, there's a Vietnamese pastor who preached a sermon on Matthew chapter 10. And one of the things he said in it is this: suffering is not the worst thing that can happen to us. Disobedience to God is. Now, by and large, the disciples' first missionary experience in Matthew 10 is very exciting and it's very effective. It's successful, we would probably say. But Jesus's third discourse is about saying it's not always going to be like that. You see, we might think, okay, this thing Jesus is doing, it's amazing. Like everyone's going to want to be a part of that, right? But in Matthew 13, the third of the 5 discourses, Jesus gives us a much more kind of measured and realistic perspective and explains why it is that so often as Christians, we will be disappointed in the effectiveness of our own lives and disappointed in the effectiveness of our mission and our evangelism. You see, this rings so true, doesn't it? In our experience, people are often disinterested. Sometimes they get angry with us. They don't want to hear what we have to say. And even when people do show some interest, after a while, they drift away. And even those who seem to make a commitment and who seem to get involved with the life of church, you know, they can disappear after a couple of years, or their involvement can seem so ambiguous and levels of commitment that are just like, you say, what's going on here? And Jesus tackles all of that head on throughout chapter 13. And he explains to us how we make sense of discipleship when it feels that as a church, we're not making any progress at all. In fact, it can feel like we're losing ground. Jesus is like, it's fine. Let me explain to you what's going on with that. Right? This is where Matthew 13 is where Jesus explains the dynamics of our relationship with the world. And one of the things that's most liberating about Matthew 13 is Jesus is really clear on where our responsibility lies and where it stops. All right. So actually, we don't have to take on the burden and worry about judging other people's authenticity. We don't have to take on the burden of sorting out who the real Christians are and who are the fakes, as it were. Right? Jesus says, look, that works itself out. And actually, that is a job for the angels at the end of the age. And if you try to do that sort of thing now, you're going to do more damage than good. Right? But actually, Matthew 13, it's not all pessimistic at all. If you read through Matthew 13, quite a bit of it is Jesus saying, there's more going on than you can see. There's more going on than you realize. There's good stuff in the life of the church. People who are kind of, living lives that are bearing a crop. All right, I am working to redeem my people. I am at work to find that which is of such great value to me. So even when it does look like things are collapsing and imploding, don't give up. Okay, so in his fourth, Jesus comes back to now this question of the church and the life of the church in Matthew 18. Not now in terms of the relationship between the church and the world, but looking at the life of the church itself. And again, I think this is something that we might find quite challenging, because Jesus has this big emphasis on belonging to and being involved in the right way with the life of the church. You see, in Jesus's vision for this new creation life, church is integral to discipleship. We need each other. We need the community of the church, even though in many ways it falls short of what we expect it to be. And this is the point. It falls short of what we expect it to be. But when you read Matthew 18, what you realize is that actually Jesus isn't surprised. It's not falling short of what he expects. He warns us exactly what church will be like. He's already taught in the Sermon on the Mount about false prophets, false teachers, false leaders in the church. And in Matthew 13, he's been teaching about false church members. The way to read Matthew 18 is it's like thinking of Jesus saying, right, but let's talk about you. If you are a true member of the church, let's talk about your responsibilities and your involvement in the community of discipleship, this community where people are learning together how to be fully human. And if you read through Matthew 18, he's talking about humility, talking about a willingness to take a lowly position and to consider others more important than ourselves. He's talking about not being a stumbling block to others, not behaving in a way that actually antagonizes other people and causes them to sin. He talks about church discipline and when to exclude people from the fellowship of the church, which is really different from our ideas that, the church should always be accepting people without judging them or calling them even to account for their behavior. Jesus is like, no, that's all wrong. You need to do this. Jesus isn't naive, you see, about the reality of ongoing human sinfulness. And in Matthew 18, he's teaching us about what happens when that sin breaches the life of the church. All right. So we've had 4 of Jesus' discourses. In the last couple of minutes, we're just going to look at his last discourse, this last pillar of Christian discipleship. And it's in Matthew chapter 24 and 25. And it's all about the coming of the end of the age and the hope that is set before us. And for Jesus, having a really firm grasp on that is absolutely critical to us being able to live a life of discipleship. Now, Matthew 24, it often confuses people. Is Jesus talking about the destruction of the temple, which he says will happen within the lifetime of the people who are listening to him? Or is he talking about the end of the age, which he says will be a long time coming? And the answer is that he's talking about both. All right, now remember back when we were looking at Leviticus, the tabernacle, and the temple is just a bricks and mortar version of the tabernacle. But back in Leviticus, we saw that the tabernacle is a model of this world. All right, and what Jesus is saying is, look, there are things about the destruction of the temple, about the end of the temple, that actually we extrapolate out because they will teach us about the end of the age and the destruction of this world on that day. It's like this visual aid, and Jesus moves between the two. He says, look, when you see the temple coming to an end, this is going to happen. And that teaches you about what's going to happen at the end of the age, when this whole fallen sinful creation comes to an end. And one of the things in Matthew 24 that Jesus is really at pains to get across to us is that it will be unexpected. Like, even those who know it's going to happen won't be able to work out when it's going to happen. In Jesus' words, that day will come like a thief in the night. All right. In fact, in 24:36, Jesus actually tells us no one knows that day. All right, you read through Matthew 24. He says, look, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. There's going to be natural catastrophes. There's going to be nations and empires rising and falling. There's going to be religious and spiritual confusion. You're going to see false prophets in the church. And godless religions will dominate the world stage. And none of those things, says Jesus, are signs that he is about to return. He says these are not signs of the end of the age. In fact, these are just the beginnings of the birth pains. These are signs that you live in a fallen, cursed, and sinful world. Right? In fact, what Jesus says in Matthew 24 is when you see the sign of the end of the age is already happening. You see, Matthew 24, our responsibility, again, Jesus delineates our responsibility. And our responsibility is not to try to work out a timeline to figure out how close we are to the day when Jesus returns. Rather, our responsibility is in the midst of the convulsions of this world, in the midst of the confusion and the compromise of the church, our responsibility is today to stay faithful and to stay on mission and to keep doing that every day until the day, the unexpected day, when Jesus comes again in glory to judge the living and the dead. And that judging of the living and the dead is what Jesus deals with in Matthew 25, right? He doesn't leave us in the dark about what the day of judgment will be like, what the criteria will be for judgment. It'll be things like, well, you read through Matthew 25, it's, did you know him? Did we use our resources to further the work of his kingdom and to seek first his kingdom? Did we care for the persecuted church, for those who suffered because of righteousness? The parable of the sheep and the goats, the big deal in that, one of the key things that will feature on the day of judgment is, what did you do for my brothers and sisters when they were suffering because of me? And his point is, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And you read through Matthew 25, and judgment, the day of judgment, has real and eternal consequences. There will be those who on that day, in Jesus's words, will go away to eternal punishment. All right, and now we're used to thinking about that maybe, but what we're not used to thinking about is the idea that the church will experience something of the day of judgment as well. But again, that's very clear in Matthew 25. There are Christians who stand before Jesus on the day of judgment. Now, it's that expectation of judgment. It's that expectation that we will stand and give account to Jesus for the life that we have lived. That is what makes what we do now so significant. That's what gives this whole thing about how we engage with the questions of discipleship. It's what makes that such a serious thing to give time and attention to considering. Right? The fact that we will stand before Jesus is why it matters that we don't just hear Jesus's words, but that we put them into practice, and that together we learn how to do that. That we follow the path of discipleship that Jesus lays down. He calls it the narrow road. All right. And what's clear is that there will be people who will have all kinds of other ideas about what it means to be a Christian. But those are not legitimate options. Right? We need to be diligent in trusting the work of Jesus, in hearing the words of Jesus, and putting them into practice. And I guess my plea as I bring this to a close now is that you would pray for us at MIE, and that we would commit ourselves to working together so that this would increasingly be the thing that characterizes our life together as a church, as a community of discipleship. That's it. Thank you.